In VR, the viewer becomes the camera or the player. So it's kind of easy to think that, well, that means that VR is always first person, right? Well, it sort of does. The person who's in VR always has a first person experience of the 360 scene or the VR scene, but that still leaves a lot up in the air, right? Whose story is it? What's the narrative point of view? So I'm going to use some examples. Narrative can be done in a couple of different ways, but by looking at some virtual reality examples that have voiceover narration, it helps us to see the difference between visual and narrative point of view and understand the importance of being able to distinguish between them. The first example I'm going to look at is notes on blindness. Some of you might be familiar with this. In this experience, we're hearing the first-person narration of John Hull. He's an author who's going blind. At the same time, we're seeing in front of us the filmmaker's best approximation of what John Hull would have been seeing. So during this VR experience, we notice that the visuals match what we're hearing. So we're going to call this matching experience an embodied first-person narrative, right? We can conclude that we are meant to be John Hull. The next example I'm going to look at is 52 Places to Go, Iceland. So in this one, we hear the first-person narration of Jada, but at the same time, we're seeing Jada. So we know we're not her. We're not seeing her visual point of view. We're seeing her. Well, this brings up an interesting point, right? It's definitely first-person narration, and it's also first-person visual, but it's different than what we just saw with notes on blindness. So we're going to call this one disembodied first-person narrative. Now, I was telling a friend about this the other day, and she's like, well, when would you use that? And so I just want to make mention of the fact that when you're trying to decide which of these tools in your toolbox to use for experiences, think about the way that you want the audience to feel. So disembodied first-person narrative actually disconnects the viewer from the scene, right? When those two things don't match, it shuts down your emotional response and ignites your intellectual response. So if you want the viewer to sort of objectively think about where they are and why they're there, that can be a good tool. If you really want them immersed in the experience, believing they're living it, having a deep empathetic connection, then you might want to use the embodied